Good afternoon and welcome to the Integrated Care Northamptonshire's Leadership Matters Conversations. This is one of a series of conversations that we've been running for a couple of years now. We aim to bring world-class leaders and thought leaders into our system to share and so that we can all learn and learn together. My name is Anne Linsell and I am the OD lead for the system, and I'm joined by my colleague Diana Belfont, who's the EDI lead for the system, and we'll be behind the scenes making sure everything works smoothly and effectively. If I can just remind you that we love to see your faces on the screen. It's always better for presenters that they can see people and see the non-verbal. So please keep your cameras on if you can, but please, if you can, mute your cameras just to avoid any background noise that may interfere. If you have any questions or comments, then please either use the raise your hand function within Teams so that we can bring you into the conversation at the correct time, or use the chat function to share your thoughts, your reflections, your comments on what you're hearing and the discussions that you have. Just to remind you that we are recording today's session so that colleagues that can't join live can watch on demand afterwards. And for anyone that is hard of hearing, you can use the transcript function within Teams on your own screen to see live subtitles as we go through. So that, I think, is enough for me. So I'm just going to hand over to Naomi Eisenstadt, who is the chair of Northamptonshire Integrated Care Board. And Naomi is going to introduce our speaker today. Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session for you. I actually signed up to the session before I knew I was going to be chairing it, so I think that's a really good sign. So it means I was interested anyway. I'm going to introduce our key speaker, who is Roger Kline, who is a research fellow at the Business School at Middlesex University. Roger has been a leading light and a really powerful force for the NHS in employment issues, particularly to do with the culture of organizations as it relates to race, employment, bullying, career progression, all those things that show us whether we are a good enough organization in treating people with equality and therefore getting the best people. So I'm going to hand over to Roger. He's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, a Q&A and comments. So Roger, welcome.
Thank you very much, Naomi and colleagues, for inviting me. Good afternoon. So staff are the NHS's greatest asset. There won't be service recovery that we all want to see unless we also have staff recovery. And we find ways to start to tackle both the exit of staff and the poor treatment of too many staff. That's a real challenge for ICSs in particular. We've got a workforce in the NHS that's 78% female. Latest data says 24% of colleagues are from Black and minority ethnic heritage, and we are a great melting pot of disabled staff, LGBT staff, plus staff, colleagues of all ages and backgrounds. But whilst all our staff work under immense pressure at the moment, some groups are and have been systematically undervalued and disadvantaged. And I'd like to discuss why we have to change that, why change has been so slow, and what research and best practice suggests we should do about race discrimination in particular. So within the NHS and indeed in local government, we have a sustained bias in recruitment and career progression with a seniority gradient linked to ethnicity, gender and disability. Disproportionate numbers of BME colleagues in particular being disciplined and referred to professional regulators. Levels of bullying and harassment for LGBT plus, disabled and BME staff that is significantly higher than that experienced by other colleagues, both from their managers and from their colleagues. Next slide, please. And although there's been some significant NHS progress, it's just not, we're just not good enough yet. So we know, you know, that white candidates are much more likely to be appointed from shortlisting within your own ICB. And you know that there's still not the level of representation that you want to see at more senior levels within the ICB. And amongst local trusts, there's a much lower gap in the relative likelihood of being appointed from shortlisting. There's a substantial gap in all three trusts on whether staff believe there are equal opportunities for career progression and promotion, although the data for Northampton NHFT is much less worse. There are more BME NEDs, but there are less BME exec members, and bullying and harassment abuse is particularly high in a couple of your trusts. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Roger, can I just interrupt you? Can you give me some headings when you're talking about the slides? As a blind person,
I'm sorry,
it doesn't make any difference to
Yeah,
it's just a blank.
That's absolutely fine. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. If you look at the data, there's no really big trends. And if you just bear in mind that figure on 1.61 in the first line, that's the relative likelihood of white staff being appointed from shortlisting compared to the likelihood of BME staff being appointed from shortlisting. If you could go to the next slide, please. Right, so this slide is an attempt to show what that 1.61 actually means if you are a Black and minority ethnic member of staff on band 5. If you want to make it to band 8D, as you can see here, there's an enormous difference by the time you get to band 8D between the relative likelihood of a Black minority and ethnic member of staff reaching a senior position in the NHS than a white one, because of the cumulative effect of that apparently relatively small difference. If we could move to the next slide, please. And I want to just draw your attention to one piece of data. There's a typo in it, actually, but you can see at the top line that there's been a significant reduction. And in fact, the 2021 figure should be 1.12. I'm sorry, I'm notorious for my typos. That's a significant and sustained improvement in that data. And it's the one piece of data in the NHS where there is sustained improvement. And later on, I want to explain why I think that has happened. If you could move to the next slide, please.
Sorry, just I know that we've got somebody who's not able to see the screen, so you may want to just go over what that data said.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, quite right. So the cumulative effect over 6 promotions of a difference of 1.61 in the relative likelihood of white and Black staff being appointed from shortlisting. If you're at band 5, which is the entry grade for nurses and allied health professions, by the time you get to band 8D, it's 28 times more likely that a white member of staff who started at the same time as you and was interviewed at the same time will be able to reach band 8D. It's a quite astonishing difference, and I've been amazed no one's ever challenged these figures. You can work it out on your own calculator. You work out 1.61 times that number of promotions. So I use that to just fairly dramatically show how small differences can have very big impacts. And the next slide that I put across was one that showed, whereas in 2016, it was 1.56 times more likely that BME staff would enter the disciplinary process. By 2021, it's 1.12, which is a very big reduction. And it was accompanied, by the way, because of what was done, it was also accompanied by a very big reduction in the overall number of disciplinaries, which I'll touch on a little bit later. If we could have the, is that okay? Can I just, if at each stage there's anything that I need to add, please do say, yeah? If we can have the next slide, please. This is just a summary, which I will just summarize why fair treatment of all staff matters, and then the next slide touches on why it's particularly important for BME staff. So there's a wealth of research. Without fairness in recruitment and career progression, we waste talent, but without inclusion, diverse representation is not sustainable, nor will it be possible to leverage the advantage it could bring. In hospital settings, managing staff with respect and compassion correlates with improved patient satisfaction, infection and mortality rates, CQC ratings, financial performance, as well as lower turnover and absenteeism. So there's a wealth of correlative evidence linking how you treat staff with benefits to the NHS and to patients. Eden King, good research, and other people have found the same thing. Where organisational leadership better represents the diversity of staff, there is more trust, stronger perceptions of fairness, overall better morale of staff. And that's obviously something for the NHS at the moment that's a real challenge. And it's worth noting, particularly for ICB board members who are here, that the revised CQC well-led rating criteria, which will be coming in the autumn, I believe, will attach more importance to fairness towards staff and will complement the new NHS workforce plan. And I say that because I'm constantly asked, and I agree with the comments, how is it possible for some organisations to be rated as outstanding on well-led and yet be very poor on equality, diversity and inclusion? We'd briefly have the next slide, please. And that's just a summary specifically on race. So where race discrimination happens, it undermines NHS values. It's a waste of talent because we're choosing people on the basis of affinity bias, who fits in, not necessarily on the basis of the best people. We know, and again, there's a wealth of research, cognitive and demographic diversity improve performance. Diverse teams that are inclusive are more creative and effective. Discrimination, both actual and the perception of it, impacts adversely on staff well-being and both their mental and physical health. That's particularly true on race, but it's also true on other aspects of discrimination. Discrimination adversely impacts on patient safety, where you have teams in which colleagues are discriminated. They're going to be more reluctant to raise concerns, to admit mistakes, and it particularly undermines the collaboration and communication that makes for effective and safe teams. If we could have the next slide, please. I've mentioned a couple of times that without inclusion, improving representation, and I'm going to speak quite a bit about representation, but touch later on discipline as another strand of race in the health service.
Sorry, Roger, please, can I ask, if you're talking now different slides, if you tell me what are the headings on the slides, so I'll get some idea.
I am sorry. This one is why inclusion and psychological safety matter.
Thank you.
So I've just lifted there, but I will summarize, quickly read it. So inclusion, this is a definition from Lynn Shaw, but it's a pretty standard one. Is the inclusion to which staff believe they're a valued member of the work group, in which they receive fair and equitable treatment, believe they're encouraged to contribute to the effectiveness of that group. Inclusive workplaces and teams value the difference and uniqueness that diverse staff bring, seek to bring a sense of belonging with equitable access to resources, opportunities and outcomes for all, regardless of demographic differences. It's crucial to the trust which underpins effective team working. And she goes on to say that inclusive, and Amy Edmondson and others absolutely endorse this. Inclusive organisations are more likely to be psychologically safe workplaces where staff feel confident in expressing their true selves, raising concerns, and admitting mistakes without fear of being unfairly judged. Inclusive and compassionate leadership, according to Carter, West, Dawson, and again, there's a whole raft of stuff. You can probably see some of it behind me. Helps to create a psychologically safe workplace where staff are more likely to listen, support each other, and there are, as a result, fewer errors, fewer staff injuries, less bullying of staff, reduced absenteeism, and certainly for hospitals, reduced patient mortality. And the reason that that's important is that without that, we can neither leverage the advantage that diversity should give us, because everybody feels safe to contribute and their contributions are valued, but equally, you won't keep people unless they feel they are valued and welcomed, and their contributions are kind of a core part of what is discussed. If we could have the next slide, please, which is, yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. So why, if it's so clear that progress on EDI and progress in particular on race equality are such a good thing, why is it that we've been so slow in moving the dial? And there's a quote here from Robert Francis, and I will read it out. This is from his 2013 reported to the Mid-Staffs Hospital inquiry, and he said, there lurks within the system an institutional instinct which under pressure will prefer concealment, formulaic responses and the avoidance of public criticism, and which ascribes more weight to positive information about the service than to information that's capable of implying cause for concern. What Mary Dixon Woods in her writing calls comfort seeking, not problem sensing. The second reason, and some of you will be familiar with this, is there's often a reluctance by white leaders, or indeed white people generally, I'm white, to talk about race for fear of saying the wrong thing. So we skate around the issue. David Thomas calls this protective hesitancy. And it's got consequences for organisations, but especially for individuals faced with managers who avoid discussions about race or honest conversations with BME staff. It becomes a car crash. It has very significant consequences for disciplinary action and for career progression. If we could move on to the next slide, please, which is called, that's it. Thank you. So we have a model that we've been using in the health service and indeed in other public sector organisations, where we've assumed that if we have the right policies, procedures and training in place, that will make it safe and effective for people to raise concerns and will ensure that people are treated fairly in discipline, when there's bullying, if they raise a grievance, if they are being interviewed and so on. There's absolutely no research evidence that supports the idea that in isolation, that's going to change the culture of an organisation. And I've summarised there some of the, I mean, there's a lot of evidence around that, but ACAS, for example, on bullying said research has generated no evidence that in isolation this approach can work to reduce the overall incidence of bullying in Britain's workplaces. And the American writers Cardiff and Dobbin, in a landmark research on 708 American companies, found that attempts to reduce managerial bias through diversity training and diversity evaluations were the least effective methods of increasing the proportion of women in employment. And if anybody cares to look at what my colleague Doyin Atewologun wrote for the EHRC 5 years ago in her review of unconscious bias training as a variety of diversity training, diversity training can improve cognitive understanding. There's almost no robust evidence that it's linked to significant changes in decision making. Next slide, please, which is called bias. That's it, on bias. And I'm afraid I've spelt ubiquitous wrongly. So my apologies for that. So bias is ubiquitous. And I've just given 3 examples there, but my point really is that it intrudes into every aspect of our decision making, mostly without us even realizing it's happening. It's very powerful. So the examples I've given are one piece of research: when man had more experience, people tended to choose to hire the man because he had more experience. But when the man had more education, people chose the man, but this time it's because he had more education. They both counted less for women. Shelley Carell found, when she was doing assessments, that the performance of women and black and minority ethnic staff was judged as lower when individuals evaluate themselves and when they evaluate others compared to white counterparts. And Greenhouse found that the achievements of black managers were more likely to be attributed from help from others rather than their own ability than were the achievements of white managers. There's lots and lots of such examples. And my point really is that bias creeps into every aspect of the career cycle: how a job is designed, how a job is advertised, informal and unstructured processes at each stage of interviewing, the access to stretch opportunities, which are crucial to career development, the use of selection tests, which tend to test what you're previously been able to learn rather than your future potential, how affinity bias impacts the decision making by panels, how panels confuse confidence and competence, and how references and CVs are read, and so on. The whole cycle of career progression and recruitment is influenced fundamentally by bias, often without colleagues realizing that's what's happening. If we could turn to the next slide, please, in alternative paradigm. Thank you. So, if a nursing director or a medical director or a finance director give a board report, they are expected to be able to explain why what is proposed has some reasonable likelihood of working. That was the evidence base behind it. And yet on equality, diversity, inclusion, we've often allowed entire action plans to be created without people really having any idea about what is likely to work or why. I'm unclear why that's the case, but I frequently meet boards. I often ask, here's your action plan, because somebody talked me through what it's like to be successful. And I'm sometimes met with really quite embarrassing silences. And the reasons for this, we have touched on to some degree beforehand, but instead of the process of relying on policies, procedures and training, what research says is we need to do the following. We need to debias processes rather more than relying on debiasing people. And anyone who looks at the work of Daniel Kahneman, Iris Bonnet, John Davidio and so on will be clear the powerful way in which debiasing processes can be much more effective than just diversity training. Secondly, people who are scrutinized change their behaviors. So an awareness of accountability acts to preempt the introduction of bias into hiring decisions. It can take many forms. It doesn't have to be beating people up or headbutting them. It can be behavioral nudges, bias interrupters, but it may also, of course, include KPIs. And finally, crucially, leadership. So leaders who are tasked with accomplishing diversity goals are much more likely to be effective when clear accountability existed. And research from others, including Tetlock and Lerner, showed that where people try to introduce EDI plans without leaders leading from the front, they're unlikely to succeed. And there's some lovely examples around the health service where leaders have done that, and it really has made a very significant difference. And I could chat about that in a discussion. So instead, if we could have the next slide, which is so there is an alternative, and in No More Tick Boxes, I tried to set out the practical implications of this. In a moment, I'll talk about how you could apply that to disciplinary action. If you look at what Mersey Care have done with the Just Culture, a lot of that resonates with this different paradigm. So whereas before, currently, we tend to emphasize policies and procedures and training, we encourage people, we give training, we have an emphasis on positive action and diverse panels, and we delegate to the Chief People Officer or the HRD responsibility for, in this case, career progression. The new model, which is drawn from the research, says that instead we should emphasize the importance of inserting various forms of accountability and transparency. We should adopt a public health approach to improving outcomes, trying to prevent discrimination rather than finding ways of responding better to it. We should see granular attention to removing bias as absolutely crucial because it happens at each stage. Not primarily think that training is going to get rid of bias, because it won't. And we need the personal. If I give one example, a big teaching hospital in the north of England, I asked the Chief People Officer why she thought she was making quite good progress on EDI. And she said, it's simple. We've done some of the things that we know we should do. And the Chief Executive has made it clear that any meeting I'm at with senior managers, they better imagine that he is standing next to me. He is responsible, and he turns up on an irregular but regular basis, have 100% turnout from all the divisional leaders, and the dial is moving. Where that doesn't happen, and it gets dumped on the Chief People Officer, who in turn may dump some of it on an EDI lead, the change will not happen. It certainly won't happen at the speed it should. And the reason that we're confident that this different paradigm is more likely to work is because in discipline, it has done. In discipline, instead of focusing on having BME people on panels and good policies, procedures and training, we've inserted a very simple system in lots and lots of trusts now, where before a manager can start a disciplinary process, investigation, they have to justify how that is focused on learning, how it takes account of the potential for bias. And it's resulted in a 36% reduction in the number of cases, the prime driver of it, 36% reduction in the number of disciplinary cases in the NHS, and the reduction in the relative likelihood of BME staff being disciplined that I referred to before. If we can perhaps miss the next slide, go on to duty of care. So just to finish, we have a duty of care that means it's towards our colleagues and indeed towards patients, which means it is not down to the person who's being disadvantaged to be the prime person who challenges their disadvantage. We know that subtle discrimination and bullying is ubiquitous and really hard to prove. We know that many leaders accept the need to become more confident in having difficult conversations. We all need to think through our own responsibilities and our own understanding of bias, particularly in respect of race. We need to put ourselves in other people's shoes, and we have to listen carefully with attention and try to create that psychologically safe environment I've talked to. And I'll finish by saying this. If we can't answer the question, what confidence can we have that what is proposed has a reasonable likelihood of bringing about the change we want to see? We should ask really serious questions about why we're doing what we're doing, because we wouldn't do that on any other significant aspect of the health service. So I'm going to stop there. A bit of banging.
Right. Thank you very much, Roger. Some really sobering data, and very interesting that there is an example of some good, things moving in the right direction and what you think were the key factors in that. So I'm going to open it up to the floor. Please use the raised hand to tell me who wants to. I mean, you don't have to ask a question. It can be a comment on what you've heard or a challenge to what you've heard, just so that we have a discussion. Yes, please. Hold on. Right. Rashmikant.
Hello, nice to meet you. I think overall we talk about equality and diversity inclusion, but there is always a forgotten part from disability, as it just lack of awareness. As I had to keep example now, reminding people are not quite astute to thinking about people with disability and their needs. So that is just a current example, but I think it's what we're talking about in the sense that this is just within the workforce, but also like when you're talking about race in representation at board level and what have you, and how or where is it that within ICS that there is a throughout the whole ICB system from start to finish at place level at corporate levels, where is the really representation empowered and listen rather than just we know it or that kind of, anyway, that's all I have to thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Raj. Shall I take a comment from Fred and then ask Roger to comment, and then we'll go on to David. So Fred.
Yes, thank you so much, Roger, for sharing the presentation. Found it really, really interesting. Some of it I'm not surprised by. I think some of the positive actions, what I really love, this is more of a comment really, I love that last couple of comments in terms of investigations, because we know that often people from underrepresented communities or backgrounds are often involved in lots of investigations, and getting the manager really to think about those two questions before they start is absolutely brilliant, and it's great to see that that has a positive impact. It's a really, really great piece of work that you shared today. Thank you for sharing.
Right. Roger, do you want to make a comment about the disability issue?
I'd take the point in terms of disability. I think we're here today to talk about race, but equally we know that, even where I work in Birmingham, it's often said that disability, is being pushed down the ladder, in terms of issues. I don't necessarily see that. I think all of this is important, and actually what we're discussing today could equally work with that with disabilities as well. I think a lot of it could just be overlaid to that. The fact that we're discussing this topic today doesn't lessen this topic, but equally it doesn't lessen disability. And I think we just need to have a wider discussion around diversity and real inclusion. That's my thoughts.
Thanks very much. Roger, did you want to comment?
Just very quickly. So when I wrote No More Tick Boxes, I was originally going to write it around race. And the more I started writing, the more I realized it made no sense whatsoever to talk just about race, rather than to talk about also gender and disability. And those three were the three I chose because that's where there is good data. It's also where there is most research. So I absolutely agree with the point. Most of the points, if anyone's waded through it, most of the points that are made in No More Tick Boxes do apply equally to gender, disability and race. I don't think you can actually tackle the one without realizing the relationship to health. In terms of investigations, I actually did a webinar this morning for the Health Services Investigation Branch. I'm not sure how uncomfortable they were with one or two of the things I gently tried to say. Bias creeps into investigations without our realizing. Once we've started an investigation, we tend to discount things that don't agree with our assumptions, our stereotypes, and we attach too much importance to things that do. And if you look at the failure to understand and change the patterns of, for example, racism within maternity services, what people were saying, I'm not giving secrets away here, was some of the white investigators find it really hard to talk openly with black patients and black staff. Well, if that's how you start, you're never going to get to the bottom of it, because people will spot that and they will withdraw and they will not be prepared to be open. So thinking through investigations and bias is really, really important. And I've seen too many investigations where that's not done. I've seen some where it's done very well.
Okay, David and then Asha, please. David Harland and then Asha Day.
Yeah, just as a bit of background, I'm not an employee of the NHS service. I'm a public governor. So my background is actually in the private sector in large international corporates. I just want to support the argument there about if it's not backed by the CEO, it won't happen. That is quite key. I had an experience recently where I raised issues with regards to the overseas recruits in an organisation, and from a point of view, I was concerned about the level of support they were getting, and I felt like I was being ran over by a steamroller and basically accused of being a racist, because I dared to raise the topic. And it goes to some of the biases and the other issues that you mentioned. So I think we have to be very aware of that. That's why I'm very conscious of the fact without strong support from the CEO, you're going to have a problem. With regards to the disabilities, I've employed disabled people over the years. And I think one of the things there is, it goes to the point you were making there about being afraid to speak to people of colour. I think people are also afraid to speak to people who are disabled. Whenever I've done it, I've always had an open conversation and said, look, when I first employed some deaf people, I said to them, look, I haven't worked with deaf people before. We're going to have to go through a bit of transition here because I'm going to have to learn. Yeah. And I think for me, it's always been about just being open and not looking at the other person in any other way than that they're a human being. Just put everything else aside. And most of those biases tend to take a back seat. But I think it is very, very challenging for all parties. And it just requires people to be a bit more open and accepting when the approach is done genuinely in a manner to help. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Asha Day, please.
Thank you. Hi, Roger. One of my roles is part of international recruitment, and I am delighted, absolutely delighted, that we are supported by our Chief Executive, Angela Hillary. And without that, our role and our word of mouth and advertisement that we get from our international recruitments wouldn't be at that level. The other thing, Roger, is that we talk about public health and we forget a lot of the public health now sits in the remit of the local authority. And for me, I am a public health specialist. I am a health visitor, public health nurse by background. For me, it's about these preventable, avoidable deaths and harm that happen to these communities. We saw it in COVID and we still see it going on. It is disproportionate, but they are absolutely preventable. Don't stick it in policies. It is that leadership that you need, and also accountability. So what are we doing? When are we going to get there? When are we going to see the change? And what we're going to do? How are we going to review it? What's the review cycle? And holding those people to account. Yes, it's different and more difficult because of intersectionality. And we used to call it jeopardy. If you were BAME and you had a disability, or if you had a differential gender bias, you had all these extra hoops that were set within you, and it affected your health. And we know that in terms of what's coming out, and the research that's coming out now from America about children and their brain development from Black Caribbean communities and how they're affected. We see this, we see it now. So what do we need to do to get our act into gear? I know it's a small scale research, but it's still prominent. And one of the reasons why you might see more NEDs, non-executive directors from a BAME background, is there's some informal coaching going on. And I know that lots of people have done it. And I think it's that active support to get people onto those boards that look like myself and other people around the room. So I just wanted to say that, Roger, and I applaud you because you're doing some fantastic work. You give us the evidence that we need to make things happen at our various levels. So thank you.
Roger, if I can just come in there, because we use the words a public health approach a lot. And I'd like some more understanding of what that means. I know what public health is, but I don't know what a public health approach means applied to this issue in terms of employment. So I'd like some help on that, please.
Shall I respond? Yeah.
Please, yeah,
So,
and yeah.
So I think that's my kind of headline shorthand way of saying we should stop waiting for individuals to surface with a particular problem. We should go out and find them. We have a wealth of data, and my wife is actually, I've never mentioned, but she's actually interim head of nursing, community nursing in a big London trust. So I know exactly what you do. We do occasionally talk work. So you don't wait for, you try to have systems that go out and look for problems, that prevent them, that try to anticipate them. I'm talking to you, Naomi, you know more about this than me. But the idea would be that if there's bullying going on in an organisation, you don't wait until someone has the courage to raise it. You have data that says staff survey data, turnover data, sickness data, informal intelligence says, do you know what, down in maternity or over in paediatrics, we've got a problem. We're going to go down and find out what it is. And we don't do enough of that. We have these systems that are supposed to encourage and make it safe for people to raise concern. But actually, for most people, it's quite a troubling time. It's quite a challenging thing to do. And very often you are seen as the problem rather than the person who's actually should be seen gold dust.
Joni, it'll get better in a minute.
So that's what I mean by public health. And if I may just briefly, David, I think it was, mentioned about people with disability, finding people are nervous and anxious about saying things. The same with gender. There's an academic phrase with gender, benevolent sexism. It's the same as protective hesitancy. I can't remember what the word is for disability. It's the same thing. It's this reluctance to be open and honest with people. And people spot pretty early on if you're not being open and honest, and quite naturally think, do you know what, this is not a safe place for me to really say what I think. So, and just a final thing on international recruits. I haven't seen Angela for years, but she used to be a fantastic chief exec, and I'm sure she still is. And with international recruits, whether they're nurses or doctors, if we don't really go out of our way to anticipate what the problems might be, we will end up othering them. In other words, we will treat them in some ways without intending or realizing as outsiders, and then we'll be surprised when they become disengaged, become disproportionately disciplined, and so on. If it wasn't for international recruits in this country, we will be stuffed in the health service, and we ought to wake up and realize that and treat them as a gift that we should treasure.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more now. There's Supra, and then after Supra, can I have Hasib Ahmed, please? So Supra, please.
Hi, Naomi. It's actually Gertrude.
Oh, sorry.
I think it's the wrong way around on the thing.
But there's no comma. I was looking really carefully, and because there's no comma, I thought, aha. No, apologies.
That's
and
okay.
Thanks for
That's
telling
all right.
me.
No
Thank
problem.
You.
No problem. Roger, thank you for a really helpful presentation. I was just thinking about the sort of area around career progression and how we best engage with candidates to understand what will support them in terms of changes to processes and practices. Because I feel like as though we do a lot of engagement that's at the sort of, staff survey level, but have you got any thoughts around how we best engage at the more local level to sort of redesign what the processes look like and how we best support people in that situation? Thank you.
Shall I?
Right.
Another question.
Yeah. Why don't we take one more? So it's Hasib Ahmed, please.
Thank you. Well, that's a shame. I had a couple of questions. I was going to make one point as well. I mean, I completely concur with the views that have been shared around disability equality. And the reason why I think it's just so important in this discussion is that, and leads on to my questions actually, we have a lot of data, and we've got a lot of data which actually does show that people with disabilities are suffering as much detriment in the workplace, and this is through the staff survey as well as the data on workforce, as people from Black and Asian minority backgrounds. Having a disability, Roger, you and I go back a few years, so you know who I am because you tripped over my guide dog once, if you remember, in a presentation a few years back. I experienced far more discrimination on an hourly basis because of my blindness than I ever do because of the colour of my skin, in comparison. And I think that needs to be taken on board and reflected in the data. With that, I think my questions are really twofold. One is around, in your No More Tick Boxes report, which is absolutely brilliant, one of the things you suggest is taking the line manager out of the recruitment process, which I love. It's really rad. And I think it will make a lot of people really, really nervous. And, you know, points back to the brilliant points you were making earlier on around debiasing the process and taking the human factor out of it. So maybe a few more words around that, and helping people to understand how we could get there. And the second question is, I've heard it a lot, and this is really pertinent to this conversation. If we get it right for race, we'll get it right for everything else. Discuss.
I think you're on mute, Roger.
Right, there's about 6 questions in there. Thank you. Let me, if I may, let me start with. Let me roll them into one question. So the answer to, super, I'm going to be really cheeky here, is I could say read No More Tick Boxes, although if I was going to write it again, I'd probably write it slightly differently. I only wrote it because, although there's huge amounts of research around this, I couldn't find anyone who pulled it all together. So really, I'm just a magpie. I just pull stuff together and try to make some sense of it. The key, so if I give you an example, I won't say the trust, but there's one trust that I do a day a month with. And and there's a number of other trusts do similar things. You can't do everything, but what you need to avoid is just having a little shopping list of, well, we'll do a bit of this and we'll do a bit of that. So what I say is there are things that combine debiasing processes and inserting accountability with leadership. And there are some low-hanging fruit and there's some more difficult things. So, for example, we know that stretch opportunities are key to people's future development, acting up, secondments, taking part in project teams and so on. Stop allowing the line manager to be the person who gets chosen. Either introduce something like talent pools, which you can do in larger organizations, or in some other way you monitor what happens and you make it clear that in particular underrepresented staff are encouraged to take part in that, and you make sure that underrepresented staff have equal access. I'll explain why in a moment. That's the first thing. So stretch opportunities should be subjected to scrutiny. The second is most of the decisions that happen in interviews are actually determined long before the interview. It's by the opportunities people have, the informal support, the cumulative effect of people's careers. But within interviews, you can make a difference. And there's 2 ways in which trusts are doing this that I've suggested, and they do seem to work. You can see why. The first is that the chief exec or the HR director says, unless you can explain how you reached your decision and what steps you're putting in place to make sure that anyone from an underrepresented group who was good enough to be shortlisted will do better next time, we're not going to accept the appointment. And that's then followed up Imperial was the first place where the chief exec did this by randomly ringing up. This is a job for you, really, Naomi. By randomly ringing up in a supportive way, so it's not a beat you up conversation. I would say if you've been the chair of a panel, Supra, especially if you've been, your division had done several, kept appointing people like me, would say, Supra, I've looked at your data. It doesn't look to me like we're reaching our goal of having fair representation for underrepresented groups. Why do you think that's happened? What can we do to help change it? And we do want it to change. And I can tell you what happens because I know what happened at this trust. As soon as this happened, everybody rang up all the other senior managers and said, bloody hell, excuse my French. I've had Tim on the phone and everybody started thinking, but at the very least, I better get my answers ready. And it actually started to change the outcomes. The combination of those two things meant that people felt I'm being watched. I need to really be able to justify the decisions I've made. And the third and final and most important thing is organizations need to have some kind of dashboard that enables them to be proactive and preventative by being able to say, geriatric nursing, we've got a problem. They're just not recruiting women. Or pediatrics, why have we got no black nurses in pediatrics? And you then go down and you, in the same way on quality, you have conversations about outliers and how things need to change. You start off by trying to introduce bias interrupters, debiasing the processes, making people aware they're watched, but also by giving them the support so they're able to do it. And one of the things, when I get a bit braver and have some confidence from the organisation, I do say to them, why don't you try removing the future line manager as being the key person in decision making? And where it's been done, it radically transforms who gets appointed. One big trust in the Midlands, when I said this, they said, oh, that's what happened when X was off twice. So his manager was off twice. They were doing 3 recruitments in that week. And then suddenly they got a much more diverse group of people appointed because she didn't appoint people that she felt would fit in or that she liked. And if further proof is there's a very big trust in London. I shan't say which one it is, but it's overlooking the House of Parliament, who decided to remove the future line manager from the recruitment of new nurses. They didn't do it for EDI reasons. They did it because their system was really clunky. So they gave a small number of people the job of recruiting everybody. And then if you wanted to be a paediatric nurse, you then later got allocated to a paediatric department. It almost eliminated race discrimination and significantly impacted other forms of discrimination. Affinity bias is not something we necessarily are aware of or think is a bad thing, but its impact is devastating for those who are excluded. There's other things you can do around that, but there's lots of practical things. If I just spend a moment on disability, very simple thing you can do around improving the treatment of staff with disabilities at trust is stop allowing the line manager to be the person who has to fund or has to fund the disability adjustments. Make that a central function, and then the individual line manager can genuinely put in their application thinking it's not coming out of my budget, it's coming out of a central budget. When it's being done, it's a really simple thing to do. It works. And wherever I go, that's what I say you should do. So I could go on, I'll shut up, Naomi, but there are lots of practical things that follow from the principles I've tried to set out.
Brilliant practical suggestions. Now I've got 3 more, but let's do Hasib and Andy next, and then afterwards David. So Hasib first, and then Andy.
I'm done. That's what I asked.
Oh, you're done. That was
yeah.
That was a historical hand. Okay. Andy then. Andy, please.
Yeah.
And then David.
I was going to ask you, Roger, in terms of if an organisation is looking to affect cultural change and to be proactive around, discrimination, prejudice, be it against the BME or other disabilities equalities, to what extent a co-production principle embedded in the organisation, I'm talking here not necessarily involving service users and carers, but obviously that's where I'm coming from. In terms some of those principles, where particularly a flattening of hierarchies where you can embed within staff groups and give voice to those equalities areas. Is there any possibility that that could be a proactive way of getting that voice and getting some of that change, particularly if it was possible to identify certain individuals and give them the opportunities to have that voice? It's just this, I don't know, I'm just having a punt at this. Is there any sort of research on that?
Shall I wait for the next question,
Yeah.
Naomi?
Yeah,
Yeah.
David, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I just quickly come in. I just wanted to sort of pick up on the point that you were making about stretch and opportunities. I agree, but in my own experience, that is fundamental to actually creating the leadership of the future, in fact. I worked in an organization many years ago where we actually embedded those processes into all our project and programs. And that was actually built in there. So we actually assigned people to tasks where we knew there was going to be stretch. We knew there was an element of risk, but we planned for that risk and we built it into things. And I think one of the things that one of the changes in our thinking that allowed us to do that was that we actually said the managers are not responsible for all decision making, which goes to another point. The decision making should come up, and only in exceptional circumstances should that command and control be put in place. And we actually limited that to crises type events where you needed, and there was planned responses, and that worked exceptionally well. And we actually had a significant number of people actually go from the bottom of the organization to the top through the course of their careers, which was really quite successful. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was the analytics side. I mean, one of the things in I was responsible for the HR systems across 22 countries in one role I had. Analytics was a key part of managing that whole thing. And one of the things I see within the NHS is a lack of analytics, really solid analytics underpinning the HR side of things. And just for an example, in one organization we actually tracked absence, disciplinaries, holiday patterns and other things, not essentially against the staff, but we tracked that for the staff underneath the supervisors and managers. And we compiled that information through their time in the organization. So we very quickly identified people who had, shall we say, certain challenges in their people management. And it was quite a simple thing to do, but we had the data there to support it. And there was a whole mesh of other stuff that we did. But I don't see that. And I think there's a real opportunity there to actually push things forward. So I think there's some very good ideas coming out.
Roger,
right, Roger, pick those two up.
So if I take them in order, if the lived experience of staff of whatever background is not part of the decision making in an organisation, the organisation is missing a trick because they're going to miss out on things, and it will affect the extent to which staff are engaged or disengaged in those decision making. We don't expect decisions on how recruitment and career progression should be done should be influenced by staff from disability networks, gender networks, neurodiversity networks, and so on, without expecting them to be the experts who will be accountable for what happens. Some organisations I've been highly critical of have dumped the job of what should be the policy. They leave it to a BME network. They come up with some well-intentioned ideas, but they bear no resemblance to what the research says. We don't want that, but we do want people to be able to say, this is where the challenges are. This is what's actually happening. Our experience is, why haven't you tried that? And that could apply to recruitment into communities that we're not, or groups that we're not drawing on, but also within the organisation. So I agree with that. I'll actually go slightly further. What if two organisations go out of their way to include, not just on senior panels, but more junior panels? This is particularly true of mental and health, mental and community trusts. Members of the public on interview panels as a matter of course. And the effect of having in effect an independent person on the panel can be very powerful if they're a good person prepared to sort of stand their ground. So co-production, I think, is a pretty important principle to embed everywhere. Analytics, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think I've had some involvement in helping to write the current EDI work plan, and at its heart are two things. First of all, the creation nationally of a repository of good practice is quite bizarre in the health service, that we have nowhere that organisations can go to find out, well, they tried this, it seemed to work, and by the way, here's the research that explained why it did. It's quite bizarre that there's no such repository. But equally important, there's going to be a requirement on organisations. You might think, David, this is a bit basic, a requirement to establish a dashboard that can be used in precisely the way you've described. In other words, it would be, and not with lots of extra, not seeking lots of data they don't have, but drawing on data that we have from staff surveys, from ESR, and one or two other sources, to be able to do that public health thing that I called, where you can think, do you know what, we have an issue here, or this is a really good piece of practice. We need to find out why it is that nobody's left this department in the last 2 years. Why? Whereas over there, they got 25% of new recruits are leaving within 2 years. So you can use that kind of data, and even fairly crude dashboards will give you information that you currently ought to have but don't. So I think that's a big issue. Otherwise, if you don't have that kind of data, concerns can be dismissed about, well, that's just your opinion. It shouldn't be just our opinion. In any walk of life, we know that acting proactively using data is a very powerful tool.
Apologies. Is that a legacy hand, or did you want to come back in?
Sorry, are you talking to me? I didn't
Yes.
realize. Yeah, no, I want to come in because I wanted to talk about when you talk about from patient to employees to the board level, all connection, and where is there any holistic approach kind of studies done? Because we people with disability, they're also included with race and diverse inclusion and gender and all that can be in all part together. So far, I'm hearing that we are just separating, and people can't separate. We are the holistic person. We are human beings. So I don't whether there's any research or any studies or whatever, because I say I'm not hearing that kind of thoughts. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Roger, should we just take Rashmikant's comment as well, and then take the two together?
So very briefly.
Yeah.
Having independent members of the panel who don't owe allegiance to the chair of the panel is a powerful way of questioning bias. However, that's why that system works. I am more skeptical. I'm not against it, but I'm more skeptical about the impact of insisting that you have diverse panels, because the research is not clear that it makes much difference. It can make a difference in the sense if you walk into a room. I mean, I'm an old white man. I've never walked into an interview ever where there hasn't been at least one other white man on the panel. That's not the experience of women. It's not the experience of black colleagues. But the things that will make the difference to the outcome are all the other things that I've described. So on discipline, for example, quite a lot of trusts have put BME people on the disciplinary panels. And I've sometimes upset people by saying, I'm not against that. But actually, the problem is that the people that you're trying to ensure have fair treatment shouldn't be in the process in the first place. So why don't we see at the very beginning, at the point of incident, how we can intervene and decide whether what is the purpose of putting somebody through a disciplinary process. Is it learning or is it blame? Would we treat a white person in the same way as we would a black person in that situation? And the evidence is that we didn't. And the evidence of introducing the systems that I've described is that people have thought much more carefully. We still have some work to do, much more carefully about those processes. I still hear lots of examples of unfairness, by the way, but less than I used to. So I think having independent people is helpful. Assuming that because somebody is disabled or is black, they can somehow represent all the range of diversity, I think is really stretching things. So I'm not against it. I'm in favour of it. But don't assume it can do things that it can't, particularly if they're a junior member of staff.
Right. Just looking, I'd like to just share an experience I had many years ago with service user involvement. And this wasn't in the NHS, it was in nurseries and getting basically the women using the children's centre I was running to help recruit for a community worker. The most valuable thing was getting their help in writing the job description, because their expectations of what they wanted from the person were quite different from mine. And of course, the person would be much more effective if in fact we were, given that their job would be to engage and work with and support this group of women. But the irony is that one of their clear requirements was that it be a woman. And we were stuck.
But there's an interesting, so I should have added to what I said earlier, Naomi, that there's quite a lot of evidence that what happens when somebody who is independent of the chair comes into the room. What counts is not so much what they say, but their presence is a form of scrutiny, which changes decision making. People think more carefully about the decision because they're thinking, well, they might go off and tell somebody.
Yeah. It's definitely true. Right. We do have a question or a comment in Raina Rani, please.
Hi there. Thank you. And thank you, Roger, for your time. I've read some of your reports and, I really do respect what you say. It's a lot of hard work has gone into them. I just want to share some feedback, really. First one is following. I've been asked to attend on exec members of an EDI panel on the interview panel before. And I love the idea of having external people there, because like you said, if you are a junior member of staff yourself, how would you not unintentionally go against your chief exec or something like that? So that's got my thought to go in. But then the other side of it, I've had candidates feedback to me where I was the only person from an ethnic background on the panel, and the person who attending interviews have been the same as me, either black or Asian or whatever. And their feedback to me was they felt safe, because had I not been there, it was an all-white panel. So for them, just me being there was a safe space for them, which I found that really fascinating. I really did. And then the final thing that I'd like to ask, please, is because I'm one of those people that obviously I read reports. But so what next? That's my constant. Okay, so this is the report, but how do we actually put any of these reports into some type of action within an organisation? I've been within the NHS for 13 years now, and I still can't get my head round or understand why we do things a certain way, why things happen like that, and how to improve things. It just seems like you're going through a minefield of the same conversations again and again and again. And then you see people who joined, say, for example, an EDI group 6 years ago, and they're walking away because not that they're still not passionate about improving things, they've just got tired of banging their heads against walls. Nothing's improving, nothing's changing. You just see brilliant staff leaving. What is the actual action plan that can be put in place, if that makes sense?
So if I briefly respond to your first, sorry, Naomi, shall I respond to that?
Yes, do please, because we don't have a long queue. Just got one more after that. So do go ahead, Roger.
So on panels, a very simple thing that panels do wrong that you can change is don't allow the chair to say what their view of the candidate is before everybody else has marked their card and said, well, I think they're this or that. Because if you do, then confirmation bias will set in and the decision will be made, and people change their views on the grounds of deference towards the chair. The more general point you make, I mean, I share your kind of angst. It's very frustrating. The change has not been at the pace that it should be. I mean, it isn't for women. 78% of the workforce are female. A minority of very senior managers in the NHS are female. That cannot possibly be right. Even though we have a female chief exec, you know, there's still a culture. So for my view is that you can do some things nationally. So the new EDI plan will start to require organisations to do certain things in the way that we haven't required them to do before. The CQC, if the CQC do go through with their proposal to basically include a rating limiter, which will mean you cannot be an outstanding trust if you're rubbish at EDI, because there are trusts, I can name some, but I won't, where that applies. That I think will, for boards, they would think we need to take this a bit more seriously. The second thing is people have to know what sorts of things have a reasonable likelihood of working rather than doing stuff because of good intentions. That's the second thing. And the third thing is change happens when organisations, a minority of organisations, do things that seem to make a difference. The reason restorative justice has grown so quickly is because Mersey Care set an example and other people thought, well, actually, that seems to work. I'm confident the same thing will finally happen on some of the stuff around recruitment and career progression, because some trusts are picking this up in a very significant way. And I think some ICSs have now committed to doing it. But I do agree. It sometimes feels like pushing water up a hill. And we have to keep doing it because it's the right thing for staff. It's the right thing for patient care, because as I said earlier, you know, there's a very good correlations between how you treat staff and how patient care is delivered. And you know, it's tragic when you see, you know, 1 in 9 nurses left the NHS last year, and I'm absolutely certain the disproportionate number of them were from BME backgrounds. That's why so many BME nurses work on the bank, because that means if they have a hard time somewhere, they can go and work somewhere else. That's particularly true in big cities. So it is hard work. It's not just you. It's very hard work. But I think there is some progress, and the discipline data, to me, proves you can make progress. But it is hard, and I wouldn't want to sugarcoat it.
Yeah, and I think it's gone back to as well having those open conversations. It's like, you know, I've got kids who are in their 20s, and we have this discussion at home. Why are we scared, or why are people scared, especially my white colleagues and white friends, to ask me a question that they've got on their mind? What is their fear of asking me it? And that's why some of the stuff we're dealing with nowadays seems to be so, we've gone from one extreme to the other, trying to make things better. On one hand, we have made it better. On the other hand, we're actually making it worse, because now we've created where my white colleagues are too scared to ask me, or too scared to even describe me as an Indian woman, for God's sake, you know. And I'm like, but guess what, guys? You know, look at this skin color. It's not white, so you definitely can't call me a white woman. So why are you scared? If you get it wrong, guess what? I'll just say, guess what, guys? I'm not Indian. I'm Pakistani. And what? I've told you for next time, so now you're aware. It's just this crazy world that we seem to have now created. But yeah, thank you.
So I've got 2 more. John Martin first, and then Annette Heslop, please. So John.
Good afternoon, everyone. John Martin. Presently the interim adult social care workforce strategy lead for North Northamptonshire. I just want to kind of ask, would it be of any benefit having a systems-wide reporting system of individual personal experiences that we as a system could actually analyze, draw the themes, and then begin to strategize an approach to addressing the fundamentals. If I use personal experience, I was recently appointed to a senior role in a London borough. First 2 days, it was hammered into my head that that senior role is front-facing. What does front-facing mean? Front-facing is it saying that I have to be of certain personality, of certain gender, certain race? Eventually, my contract was terminated because of how I looked, how I appeared. I could easily publish my experience on the social media, but all it will generate is emotions. It will not address, it will not give avenue to address what is a very serious and fundamental issue within the system. So that's my question, really. Do we think that having an easy, accessible reporting system of individual experiences could help to begin to understand what individuals are still going through and how people's experiences are actually impacting on their perception of the health and social care systems?
Do you want to pick that one up now, John, or do you want to hear Annette first and do two together?
I don't mind. Take them together if you like.
Right. Okay, Annette.
Hello. Well, I'm from London. I got invited by, I think Diana sent me the invite, so to join your meeting today.
Welcome.
Thank you, Roger. It was really lovely what your presentation was really brilliant. And as always, so my question was not even a question, it's just that we in the London area, or the Royal Free, that's where I'm from, we started some work on anti-racist, becoming an anti-racist trust. So we started some work on that. So we're starting to have some training regarding that. So there was a lot of questions. There's a lot of difficult questions, as people say, difficult ones. We've also had the White Allies program as well. We've also done the diverse interview panels. So we've done that as well. I was actually on the WRES frontline workers with Diana. So that's why I met Diana from. So we actually started that, and there was an article in the paper about that as well, regarding why if you don't appoint a Black person, you've got to answer to the CEO to say why you haven't done so. So that's what there was a message in the Guardian about that as well. So I'm shocked with what that gentleman just said just now. That is so wrong and out of order. So I haven't really got a question, but I'm just making it known that we are doing stuff in the London area. And then when I'm listening to what you guys have been going through down in your area, I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot of stuff that we need to do. And we have there's a lot to do. And we as Black people need to we know what's going on, and we need to make a change, basically. And I agree with what Roger has said. We need to make a change, and equality needs to be the main focus of what we do, because we are representing members of the public as well as staff. It's not just about us, it's about everybody. That's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Right, Roger, do you want to comment on those two?
So if I take the second one first, yeah, I think it was the Daily Mail who had a front page article where they ran out of news. There was nothing else to talk about.
Yes. Sorry.
which said how disgraceful it was that panel members were being asked to explain their decisions. I can't think of anything worse that you could ask an organisation to do than to ask managers to explain a pattern of apparently unfair decisions. Complete nonsense. I have to say, I found it quite concerning that the NHS nationally does not respond to those sorts of things. I think it'd be much better if they did, but that's a discussion for another day. And the Royal Free is doing a number of good things. I'm aware of some of them, in a way that I'll say this because I said it to the chief exec. When I wrote the Snow White Peaks, and this is perhaps a sign of progress, when I wrote the Snow White Peaks, I wrote to the Royal Free along with every other trust in London and said, can you please confirm the ethnicity of your boards? And the board secretary at the Royal Free at the time wrote back to me and said, we don't have to answer this. It's a breach of, there's a data protection issue. So I said, but I've looked on your website, and as far as I can see, there's no BME people on your website. So is that what I should write down? And he said, you're not being serious. I said, I tell you what, if you don't confirm the ethnicity of I will report you to the Information Commissioner. And then they went back and said, well, we've got 11 people on the board, and they're all British. And I said, I can't find that category in the census. Are they white, green, blue, or yellow British? Anyway, I told this to your current chief executive a couple of years ago. The Royal Free has changed. It hasn't changed as much as it needs to, but it has changed. It's much more aware of it as an issue. And there's quite a lot of trusts where that is happening. Not a majority yet, but there is starting to be movement. And to go back to the earlier question, it is really important that we take on board the individual experiences of people, because we're individual human beings. But I think we have to accept we face an institutional pattern of discrimination in the NHS. So we do need to listen to individuals, and we need to build on that individual experience. But we need to understand that we have to find ways to change the institutional barriers that get in the way of individuals making progress. And what I would say is, maybe as a final point, I went to an ICS recently, and I won't say which one, but I was very surprised at a brilliant conversation. This was just a board meeting, at which this is not meant as a hint, but it probably is. The board had a long conversation. I didn't have a single question. Not a single question. It was all a discussion within the board. And it was about, OK, we know that we need to do more. What clout do we have that can enable us to do the things that we know are the right things to do that would improve it? And they came up with the idea, we're going back for the discussion. Well, we commission services. Is it not possible to find a way when we commission services that we expect to see evidence from everybody who provides services that they're taking the issue of EDI and particularly race seriously? And it was unanimously agreed that they should try and find a way of doing that. Now, you are young enough to remember when things like that were not unusual. So I think one of the opportunities for ICS is, in a sensible way, is to think through how can the commissioning power be used as a system-wide level to say, actually, if you want to provide services to us, we want some evidence that you're treating your staff and your patients in a way that takes account of their ethnicity, their disability, and so on. So I think ICS it's not the only place I've had that conversation. ICS has started to think through after a kind of, you're coming into being at the most ridiculously difficult period, but maybe started to sort of raise heads above parapet is worth thinking about, and those sorts of things.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm going to make a few final comments, if that's all right. We've got a couple of minutes left. Incredibly impressive. And I suppose to pull out the things that I found most useful, is the use of survey data to identify and prevent problems before before you wait for a complaint. And I chaired an investigation into sexual harassment in one of the biggest of the children's charities against a very senior member of staff. And I asked for the survey data, and they hadn't done it by gender. They did it by race, they did it by department, they did it by grade, they didn't do it by gender. And when you looked at the turnover rate of women in this person's department, it was all set. It was just remarkable. So that was a very strong example of how important survey data is. I was really interested in the comments on evidence of impact, because it's astonishing in the NHS that would never do anything to a patient that didn't have some evidence that it works. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the level of proof required to do an intervention in the way that we work with our service users, as opposed to the kinds of things we think will work with staff and say, oh, well, somebody tried it, it was okay. So that I think is really, really important. And I think that the other one about monitoring the access to stretch, and I'm certainly going to talk to Toby about this, on our next one-to-one, because my guess is that doesn't happen in our system. So I'm going to finish with a funny family story. I hope that's okay, about intersectionality. So about 30 years ago, my ex-brother-in-law, and this is why he was an ex-brother-in-law, came out as gay. And they had 2 young children, and his daughter was then about 9. And all the adults were in corners about what impact this would have on their children. It's 30 years ago. It's a long time ago. It was a much bigger issue then, although I'm not sure it would. Anyway, so I'm a children's rights person, and I went to my niece, Lisa, and I said, well, I didn't say, how do you feel about your father being gay? I said, how do you like Ken? Ken was her father's first boyfriend. And she said to me, Ken's very nice, but he's not Jewish.
If I may say, Naomi, as someone who is Jewish but an atheist with a rabbi as an uncle, I really appreciate that joke.
I told it all over the world. I told it to Maori audience, and I got a good laugh.
A very good joke.
It's a true story. It's actually, I mean, it was what was salient to Lisa. She couldn't care less about gay men. Anyway, I want to thank you very much, Roger. It was a terrific session, and I want to thank all the participants for coming and and helping me. It's power to my elbow, and I'll need all your help in trying to make some of the changes we need to make. So thank you very much, and you've got 1 minute more than you thought you had. So thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We'll send out links to feedback and to the subsequent sessions via email. Thank you all very much.